Do you ever suspect that you may be self-sabotaging? On today's episode of Man Up, that's exactly what we're talking about. Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Man Up, your podcast with all the encouragement that you need to be a better father, husband, leader, and follower of Jesus. We're a band of brothers, we're soldiers, we're comrades in arms, and we fight side by side, shoulder to shoulder, hand over hand, and mile after mile until each has helped the others attain the high calling of Jesus. All right, today, guys, we're talking about something that's been on my mind a lot. I actually talked about it on Biblically Speaking when it comes to our faith, but we're talking about self-sabotage. This is something that people do all the time, but particularly because of the cultural climate that we live in, where it feels like our entire world is sort of turning against men, that what we are beginning to see is that a lot of men are giving in to self-sabotaging behaviors. And this is not a new thing. I shouldn't say beginning, that we've always sort of embraced these behaviors. And I don't want to take up much time because it's just me. I don't have a guest today, but I want to jump right into them. If you happen to be watching this on the Real Dad channel, I want you to really consider what I'm saying. Leave some comments here. Talk about some things that you see in your life and how you overcome these self-sabotaging behaviors. So if you're wondering where I happen to come up with this list, I actually put in some of my own information, some things that I feel concerns about or worries or anxieties about, and I put them into Chat Gpt, the AI that's out there. And I asked it to give me some information on just different publications that have been written about men and self-sabotaging behaviors. And it took what I put in and it sort of married that up with these publications. And the first one that it said that a lot of men suffer from is fear of vulnerability. Now, this goes back to a survey by YouGov. It says 31% of men reported feeling uncomfortable discussing their emotions with others. Now, this was compared to 17% of women. Now, 31% of men is probably an underreport. But this is something that Dr. Kenny Embry and I have talked about several times on the show, is that men and women relate differently to emotional communication, that women tend to bond over feelings and shared emotions, whereas men tend to bond over shared experiences. We're finding fewer and fewer outlets to have those shared experiences. One study that was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and I'll put links to these in the description, says that men who have difficulty with emotional intimacy are more likely to experience relationship problems. Now, this study is eye-opening to me because when I think about this and I think about men and how we communicate, that if emotional intimacy is a predictor of the health of relationships, then one of the ways that we self-sabotage those relationships is by holding back part of ourselves. And that can affect our marriages. It can affect the relationship with our children. Those of you that aren't married, it may affect the relationship with the person that you're pursuing and in a relationship with already, or the ideal woman that you're thinking about. That all of those relationships can be impacted by the varying degrees of emotional intimacy in our life, not necessarily just with that one person. If we don't have this outlet, the compartments of life kind of start spilling over into one another. And that's one of the things that I saw in a review of several studies on vulnerability and mental health, that men who are more open, this tends to be a trend in these kinds of discussions, that men who are more open and vulnerable tend to have better mental health outcomes. You can deal with problems and stresses in life in an emotionally healthy and mentally healthy way, as opposed to the self-aggression that typically is one of the self-sabotages that we engage in. That aggressive men are not necessarily aggressive toward the outside world. Sometimes we're aggressive. We're too hard on ourselves, and that sets up this cycle where we just can't overcome. And part of this is realizing that at some point, we've got to be unburdened. Lauren calls me her atlas, that I sort of walk around with the world on my shoulders. And that's not a compliment. That's a reality check for me, that eventually I have to become unburdened. I need to let go of the worry. One of the verses I've been meditating on a lot personally. I know not all of you are believers, but maybe this will cause you to look at the Bible at least in a new way. But Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 11. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weak and heavily burdened, and I'll give you rest. But you're going to have to take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I am meek and gentle in heart, and you'll find rest to your souls." That part of the soul burden that we carry is feeling like every problem is mine. And without that emotional outlet, without that emotional intimacy, then front and center before us all the time is this thought that I am inadequate to this task. And that leads us to another problem that we're going to talk about in just in a moment, which is the imposter syndrome. But some of the things that we should be doing, we need to be looking for these kinds of outlets that we can bond, particularly with other men, that our spouse should not be our only burden bearer. Our kids certainly should not be our emotional burden bearer. We need to be looking for outlets where we can bond with other men and those shared kind of activities that Dr. Kenny Embry talked about. Dr. Joshua Ellis was on the program, has been on the program a couple of different times. He talks about those things. We need to be looking for those outlets, and we need to realize that is a healthy expression of emotion. We also need to learn and practice emotional regulating skills. Sometimes I know emotionally when it comes to frustration or worry, I go from 0 to 100 without any stops in between. We can allow things to ramp up and become urgent without them becoming world ending. And that's part of that healthy mentality that we're trying to bring about in ourselves, and even a biblical mentality that we're trying to grow within ourselves. I can reappraise situations and I can be mindful of where I'm at, and that will help me with the second self-sabotage, and that is emotional regulation. That very often we struggle with realizing that there's a difference between urgency and anger. And this is not toxic masculinity. You guys know where I stand on that. I've still got an episode I want to drop. It just takes a lot of editing, and I'm waiting for the right time to drop it, a time when it's sort of become a hot button again in our culture, which I suspect is going to happen in the next few weeks. But this idea of emotional self-regulation and realizing that I don't have to be all in on frustration or all in on anger. And part of that is that first point of letting go of the burdens. But a couple of different studies that I looked at, one was by the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, which states that men are more likely than women to experience problems with anger and regulation. And that's really just outward expressions of anger, but again, self-loathing kind of feelings. One survey by the American Psychological Association said men are less likely than women to seek mental health treatment. That's a big stigma for us as men. That can be a contributing factor. That's why guys like Joshua Ellis are so important. That can be a contributing factor to not having this healthy emotional regulation. There's a lot of research that talks about just being intentional and mindful about the things that we do can help us regulate emotionally. That if I'm not always in the place of reacting to everything, if I am being intentional, if I take a moment and say, you know what, yeah, this is a bad situation, but I can make it a lot worse by doing the wrong thing. If I just take a moment, a breath, a beat, and say, okay, let's analyze, let's process, and then let's figure this out, then I'm going to be emotionally in a much healthier place to regulate myself because I'm not running on pure adrenaline at that point. That some of the things that we can do, obviously, and I've mentioned him twice now already, but guys like Joshua Ellis, some sort of counselor, some sort of outlet where we can talk through things in a safe space, that can be very helpful to men. We want to not shun that just because it's not traditionally the way maybe our fathers handled the situations. The second is we can develop a regular self-care routine. That's one of the things that sort of gets lost in all of this is we get so busy taking care of everybody else, or maybe we get so busy with our own wants that we forget to take care of our needs. One of the needs that we have is emotional intimacy. God showed man in the garden in Genesis chapter 2 that it wasn't good for him to be alone. That wasn't a revelation of God. That was a revelation to man. You need a woman. You need somebody in your life to help you regulate that. Now, that completely flies in the face of kind of the Andrew Tate movement of I don't need no woman, a woman needs me. We need each other. God created us this way, and that's one of the failings. I know he embraces Islam as a religion. That's one of the failings of that religion is that God did not design women to be subservient, that he designed them to be the help that men need. And subsequently, because they are our opposite, we become the help that they need. It's a perfect union, and that's how God describes it, that the two become one. And that's not just talking about the sexual union there. But thinking about this, that one of the things that we can do is developing that regular self-care routine. It's something that is you for you. For me, some of it is a creative outlet. That's part of why I do so much YouTube and podcasting. It's a creative outlet that helps me take care of myself, that even though it can be stressful at times, it actually helps me unburden a little bit. For some guys, it's workout and diet. For some guys, it's planning the next vacation or something like that, but it is a self-care kind of thing. And if we're not thinking about it in the light of this is taking care of myself, it's probably just going to become another burden that we're not really processing the way that we should. Now, the third thing that is a self-sabotage and again, this is based on the feedback that I put into Chat GPT and then the analysis of a lot of journals and studies and things like that, but it came back with imposter syndrome, which interestingly enough is something that Kenny Embry was talking about in his Balancing the Christian Life channel just a week or so ago. But we do suffer from imposter syndrome. If you don't know what imposter syndrome is, it's kind of the fake it till you make it attitude. It's feeling like you're in a room with people and you don't really belong. That idea of imposter syndrome is, again, this idea of internalizing too much pressure. We internalize too much on ourselves. We don't use that relationship with God, who told us through Peter to cast all our anxiety upon him and know that he cares for us. We don't trust him to make us perfect. We feel like I'm not perfect on my own. And that imposter syndrome is such a dangerous thing. If you're a father, if you're a husband, if you're a leader in God's people, that imposter syndrome of feeling like I don't deserve this. You know what? There's nothing wrong with the feeling of I don't deserve this, because there's no truer statement that you could ever say when it comes to your faith. You don't deserve this. When it comes to my relationship with my wife, I don't deserve her. When it comes to my son and the relationship I have with him, I don't deserve him. But that doesn't make me an imposter. It just shows me how much I have to give and how joyous it is to give to those people. And that's part of the solution. But this idea of the imposter syndrome is interesting because the journal Behavior Science had this survey that said 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. This feeling of, I don't belong and I'm worried that others are going to discover that. One study, and this was published by the Journal of Vocational Behavior, says men are more likely than women to suffer from imposter syndrome in the workplace. And it sort of rolls into this idea that at any moment, I'm not like my peers, I'm not as good as they are. At any moment, I could be found out and I'll be the next one kicked off the ship. And this can grow, particularly during times of uncertainty like we're in right now, where we have this fear of economic collapse in our country and companies are paring down. These are moments where, particularly for men who we don't feel like we've achieved enough, that we begin to feel the stress of this nagging question of what if I'm discovered? Chances are every single person in your company, no matter what confidence that they're projecting, and every single person in your congregation where you worship, and every single person in your family that's attained an age where they can really internalize their own monologue, has that same feeling. What if I'm discovered? What if my flaws stand out in front of everybody? And that fear of being found out as an imposter keeps us from seeking out that self-care, from seeking out those outlets to build those bonds that help us become emotional burden bearers for one another, because it requires a vulnerability. At the bottom of this imposter syndrome is the fact that as men, we don't often feel like we can trust each other with our inadequacies, that rather than going and seeking out a mentor the way that we should, we tend to project a bravado that maybe isn't really there. One of the things that's been a real blessing for me in moving to Portland, Oregon, is that I met Brian Haynes. And Brian is not a mentor to me, but Brian is a good friend. He's been a good emotional outlet for me. There's a reason why I tapped him to be a part of the new Biblically Speaking podcast. It's video, so it's on the YouTube channel as well, but it's also an audio podcast, and I'll put a link to it in the description. But it's one of the reasons why I trusted him with that. And we can have that host-co-host kind of relationship that is based on mutual trust and not just shared ideas. And so really understanding that imposter syndrome is one of the things that all men are struggling with, that we can seek out things like mentors, that we can stop practicing self-comparison. That's one of the big things about it. It's not just a lack of trust, but we compare our lowlight reels to everybody else's highlights. And my wife taught me that. That's one of the things that she said, Jared, that's one of the things that you do all the time, is that you see all the points that you mess up, and then you go and look at somebody else's best day and you say, oh, well, I'm not like them. We lose sight of the highlights. And our lowlights become the things that stand out to us, particularly when we're suffering from that imposter syndrome. Now, the fourth thing that we get out of whack, and this really comes down to more on the fatherhood side than just the man side, is we get the work-life balance out of whack. And maybe self-care should be part of this too. But, and this is something that falls on me because, as I said, some of my emotional outlets are also work. It's creating the podcasts, it's creating the YouTube channels, it's all the things that I do to try to encourage men and Christians to stay in the fight. And Lauren pointed this out to me just yesterday. She says, you've been so busy getting the new podcast off the ground and getting the Biblically Speaking podcast and getting Man Up going and keeping it going. And you've been so busy creating shorts for YouTube. There's not many moments when we're all at home when your laptop is not out and you're not working on something. And that's guilty as charged because I'm trying to do the Sean Cannell thing. If you follow Think Media, as I've mentioned before, you should, even if you're not a YouTube creator. But I'm trying to give 150% in this season because I want to see what comes out of putting that much effort in. I want these things to grow. I want to reach millions of men if I can with a message that God is reaching out to you and has reached out to you, but you've got to reach back to him. I want that audience to grow and I want to succeed in those things because I want to help as many people as I can. And in this season, I am 150% all in, and that thought is overwhelming. And I do have to step back some days and say, okay, 150% is 150%. But at the same time, I've got these people who need me not to be so plugged in at some moments so that I can be fully present with them. Now, I don't disregard them. I don't shun them. I definitely don't cloister myself away in an office. I'm usually downstairs working as Will is doing school and things like that. But there are moments that I need to say, okay, this has got to stop. I've got to turn this off. I'm going to have to delay getting this out because the people in my life need me to be 100% present for them. And that's tough. But one of the surveys by the Pew Research Center said 56% of working fathers say it's difficult to balance their work and family responsibilities. Now, I was actually reading a book on this the other day. I think it was Atomic Habits. I forget which one. I'm reading so many books right now. One of them is called Hook Point. I'm reading Atomic Habits. I'm reading a lot of different books on men and being better men and just generally being a better communicator. But one of the books was talking about the fact that one of the reasons why we struggle with work-life balance is because that puts the two at odds with one another. That instead, I need to ask, what kind of life do I want to have? Work has to be part of it. Home has to be part of it. And I need to look for a synergy between the two. I need to make my work give me a better home life. And my home life needs to not contribute to the stress that I have at work. And that healthy kind of synergy arrangement there means that I have to stop thinking about the two as opposed to one another. And if I can't do that, if I can't see them instead of in a balance where one's getting too heavy so the other is suffering, if I can't see them working in a synergistic, is that even a word? Synergistic. In a synergistic way, if I can't see them working in a synchronous way, let's say, then what ends up happening is that one or both of them will suffer and collapse. And it may be an indication that I'm in the wrong career. If I really suffer from really bad work-life imbalance, or I can't get my head around work is not the enemy of the home life kind of thing, it may indicate that I'm in the wrong career. And men need to think about that. Men need to really stop and say, okay, if I can't find joy in this, and this doesn't make the other part of my life more enjoyable, then maybe I'm in the wrong place, or maybe I'm doing the wrong thing, or maybe I'm resisting something that I really should be doing. That led to even more research on finding ways to make work more flexible. We live in a day where telecommuting is a real option for some of us, that having more time at home is a real possibility. I know I basically take one day a week now, or half a day a week, and go down to the church building because that's where the elders have asked me to do that. So that's where I'm working on Wednesday afternoons. But the rest of my time, I'm at home. So if I need to put down the Bible class material that I'm writing, or the YouTube episodes that I'm writing for our evangelistic effort there at the Fifth Street Church of Christ, then I can do that. I can put that down, and I can be there with Will when he's having a bad school day, or he's feeling inadequate or something like that. Then I can have those moments. But also just saying no to things. I think that's part of it. That I've got to get to the point where I have to say no. That I have to say, this is not mine. It's not for me. I cannot do it. And not feeling the obligation just because it's been put to me. But if I don't do these things, if I don't set these boundaries around my time and my family, if I'm not seeking support from others. Like I was getting ready to launch the new podcast the other day, and I sat down and it was just me in a room, and I told myself having to schedule guests every week is not going to be fun. It's not going to be good. It's going to require a lot more work. And I need to find somebody that I can trust, that I have good communication skills with, that I have a good rapport with. I need a co-host. It's my time to depend on somebody. And I thought, who can I depend on like that? There were several guys around the country that I thought of, but they were all in different time zones. It ended up being that the first guy on the list was the right one. That was Brian. He lived right around the corner from me. We're in the same time zone. My only concern was he had a lot of other obligations to some other social media platform things that he did, but I bit the bullet. I just told him, I said, I've got this great idea. You're going to think I'm loony for starting another podcast, but I need a ride or die partner with me. And Brian's like, yeah, I'm all in. Let's do it. And our first episode, I think was great. It's getting a lot of traction on YouTube. I think it's getting a lot of traction on the podcast airwaves. Not as much there yet, but it's brand new. And I'm so glad that I did that, because seeking that help allowed that to become better than it would have been otherwise. And that's one of the things that I had to realize is it would never have been as good if I tried to be the host and not have a co-host with me. So I didn't have to worry about getting the right guest for the right topic. Brian and I can brainstorm on that weeks in advance. And that's the kind of thing that understanding that means that I now have a real possibility of success with that podcast. And my buddy gets to come along on the journey. And how much better is that? So understanding that work-life balance is important also means that we need to stop and think about fatherhood and becoming very intentional. I used that word earlier. Guys, our marriages are important, but fatherhood, we need to remember that we're making a lasting impression on our children, particularly, now I won't say particularly our boys, because I mean, our little girls are looking at their fathers for what kind of man they should look for, or what the definition of a man is. I know some young ladies that have become completely jaded toward men because of things their fathers did. So our children, our young men, our young women are looking at us, and they're internalizing messages through our fatherhood about what it means to be a man, or what kind of man, if we have daughters, that they're looking to pursue. One survey by the National Center for Fathering said only 20% of fathers report spending more than 2 hours a day with their children. Now, that's not to say that the father is always working. Sometimes there's a busyness here that we need to realize, that having our kids involved in all of the sports after school and all of the things like that, we need to realize that is detracting. If those are spilling into time after we get home from the office, that's detracting from our ability to be an influence on them. And there's a reality to that. I understand the idea of having them in sports and learning good sportsmanship and learning teamwork, and I understand having them involved in things, but we need to ask the question, at what cost? And for our family, can my influence sustain that extra activity? That can my influence sustain that? Or am I giving away too much? And is there a way, if that's something they really want to do, that I can reconcile the two, that I can make the time up somewhere else, or I can become involved in it? And that's an important talk that we have to have, not just with them and their activities, but we have to have it with ourselves. But one study in the Journal of Family Psychology says fathers who have emotional involvement in their children's lives have better mental health outcomes, both for the father and the children. Now, there are lots of studies. In fact, I'll link to one. I think Pew did it about the predictor. It's either Pew or Barna, the Barna group. But it's a predictor of, one study was looking at whether or not our children will stay faithful to God. And it looked at fathers and their involvement in faith as a predictor for that. And I'll put a link to that. I don't remember if it was Pew or Barna. I just thought of that off the top of my head. But that as a predictor for our children's outcome of spiritual success is huge. But also their emotional success, that when we take that and we internalize it, then we become not just better fathers, but we become better men. And we show our children that we're trying to be intentional about their upbringing. That's one of the things that the Bible teaches, that fathers are to bring up their children to know the care and the instruction, or the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, and this is going to wrap up the show for us, is that, and this is something we've talked a lot about on this program and in different episodes, but it's the negative self-talk. One of the ways that we really self-sabotage our lives is that we have this constant projector running through our head, and this goes with the imposter syndrome of because I'm impersonating this thing that I'm not, that I am not worthy. And that idea of negative self-talk is it's an abnormal psychology. I mean, it's one of the things that Joshua Ellis and I had talked about a couple of times on the program, but it's an abnormal psychology. And one study published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology said men are more likely than women to engage in this negative self-talk. And I sort of call it, or I call it disaster grooming, that when I engage in negative self-talk, it's always about the worst thing that can happen, and it sort of paralyzes me with fear that you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you don't make enough money, you don't do that. All of those things paralyze me, and it just becomes this. I mean, you're never going to hear. I don't remember where I heard this. Maybe I made it up. I don't know, but you're never going to hear a voice that is as loud or carries as much authority as your own. You're just not. And if the internal monologue is negative, no amount of outside affirmation is going to change that. And we all go through these seasons where the internal monologue is just negative, negative, negative. That's all we say to ourselves. And we need to realize just how destructive that is to us as men. That there's a lot of research that associates negative self-talk with higher levels of stress and anxiety. There's a lot of research that also says that cognitive behavioral therapy, intentionally working on the words that we use and associate with ourselves, can actually lower stress and anxiety. And that can be a form of casting our burdens on God. That in prayer, if we're using the words that affirm that God is taking care of us and we're reminding ourselves of that, I mean, we're not reminding God of that. We're reminding ourselves of that. But if we're having those regular kinds of conversations, that actually lowers stress and anxiety and gives us the breathing room to let go of those fears of being an imposter. It gives us the breathing room to think better thoughts about ourselves. And that's really all that it takes to let go of that self-talk. Is I say it's all that it takes, but it's sort of a big hill to climb. I have to self-censor the words that I'm using, because if I don't control the conversation I'm having with myself about myself, who's going to? Well, guys, we could spend a lot more time on this, but it's just me, and I wanted to try to keep this episode at about 30 minutes or less, and so we need to go ahead and hang it up here. But I want to say, if you are in this mode of self-sabotaging, then take a moment, take a beat. Get back to your roots. Get back to the Bible. Get back to your guy friends. Get back to your emotional burden bearers. Go make some emotional burden bearers that get out of the rut of constantly reacting on adrenaline and anger. Realize how that's affecting your work-life balance, your relationship with your kids. Realize all of those things and silence the negative self-talk in your own brain. Because if you don't do these things, it's just going to continue to get worse, and nobody's going to be there to help. Guys, it's time for us to realize that the whole alpha male thing of I did it myself, it's just not working. It's not working for 90% of us, and maybe the 10% of us that it actually does work for, most of them are probably faking it. So let's get back to being healthy. Let's get back to being God's men. And until I see you again, have a good day. God bless. And man up.